radio contact.
What kind of people are we?
I am in radio contact.
What kind of people are we?
Attention crew, this is your Captain Caliban speaking. This is a supplemental episode of Enterprising Individuals, where we bring you news and tidbits from the world of Trek, also interviews with special guests, and a few little surprises along the way. Well, the show is back up to full speed after recovering from some equipment problems. Not an auspicious start to our fourth season, but it's not going to hold us back, and we're blasting out of the gate. You can hear our recent Trek news show that released this weekend. We're trying something a little different there. I'm joined on that episode by Mikan Hana of the Just Enough Trope podcast to break down recent Trek news, and we specifically detail the various Trek series, either in development or production, so check that out. Today's episode is a more traditional supplemental episode. Last week I talked with Lee Sargent about The Devil in the Dark and its depiction of the Horta, one of the stranger aliens encountered by the crew of the Enterprise on their 5-year mission. Okay, so hold that thought. Last season of the show, our last regular episode, I had Alan Gratz on to talk about Threshold, the quote-unquote worst Trek episode of all time. Asterisk, as I think we proved on that show. During that show, I brought up a paper that had been published in a scientific journal early last year. The paper made the news as an example of the unethical practices of some scientific and medical journals. They'll publish a paper for a flat monetary fee without any kind of real review, and they'll do it on any subject. The subject in this case was rapid genetic and developmental morphological change following extreme celerity, or, for the layman, why you'll turn into a salamander if you break the Warp 10 barrier. That paper was written by the pseudonymous BioTrekkie, the identity of whom Alan and I speculated on greatly to no avail. I can say one thing for sure, though. My guest on today's episode, Dr. Mohamed Noor, is not BioTrekkie. He is a professor of biology at Duke University and the Dean of Natural Sciences for Duke's Trinity College of Arts and Sciences. But BioTrekkie? Who, him? Nah, man. Keep looking. I talked to Dr. Noor about biology and science in Trek, about how when we finally meet aliens like the Horta, we might not recognize them as sentient life. And yes, we talk about that episode of Voyager. After my talk with Lee Sargent last week about The Devil in the Dark and that episode's theme of life not always being what we might expect, I thought there'd be no better follow-up than to hear from a real-life biologist about what aliens might really look like. And Dr. Noor was happy to oblige. I never did hear back from BioTrekkie, though. That's weird. Here's my interview with Dr. Noor. Stick around after for a few announcements about what's new this year on the show. And with that, let's get underway. My guest on the show today is Dr. Mohamed Noor. Dr. Noor is a professor of biology at Duke University. He's the former chairman of the Duke University Department of Biology, and he's the incoming dean of natural sciences for Duke's Trinity College of Arts and Sciences. And he's the recipient of many teaching and mentoring awards. He's also the author of Live Long and Evolve, What Star Trek Can Teach Us About Evolution, Genetics, and Life in Other Worlds. Dr. Noor, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's good to have you aboard. I always ask new guests on the show how they first became Star Trek fans. How did you first discover Star Trek?
So I was about 8 or so, and I was on a trip with my parents visiting some friends of theirs, and it was just on the TV there in the background. I remember sitting there watching it thinking, wow, this is really interesting. What is this? And they told me this was Star Trek. And when I came home, I said, I want to watch this show. So I found out, through the TV guide or the TV week thing through the newspaper when it was on, and I just started watching it and went from there.
And was it initially something, did you have an interest in science even as a kid? Were you fascinated by the science and science fiction you were seeing?
I definitely always loved science fiction. I remember when I was very young, I used to love the cartoon Star Blazers.
Yes.
Do you remember that? That was really fun.
I remember that one. Sure, yeah. It's not exactly Star Trek, but,
no,
but it's definitely, yeah. Yeah, I always enjoyed, I enjoyed Star Trek for the same reason, but I always enjoyed sci-fi cartoons and that sort of thing. And they always seem to have an adventure bent. Star Wars, you're shooting things, you're fighting the evil empire. But Star Trek was so different because it was they were trying to not fight. They were trying to not get in trouble
No,
with
exactly.
people and trying to smooth things out. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, that was actually the contrast to everything else I had watched up until that point. The point wasn't just, we're being hunted and shot at, or we're hunting other people and shooting at them, but this idea of exploration was really interesting. And incorporating social issues into it was also, even though I was pretty young, I still thought that was very interesting. So I was very much drawn in by it. And I kept going with the later series with Next Generation, though I have to admit I almost dropped it after the second season of Next Generation. I came back after that for the rest of it, and for Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, and now Discovery. It's been great.
I'm glad that you stuck around. I can see or I'd understand if you didn't want to, but yeah, it's definitely worth staying for. And it's just so, I always reflect on how amazing it is that this idea that this guy, Gene Roddenberry, had was able to last so long, not just because it's a great idea, but because it's able to adapt to society and to what we're facing. And you can do so many things with this very simple premise of exploring the stars.
Oh, I completely agree. What I've also been impressed about now as I've gotten to be a scientist, obviously this wasn't my first impression when I was 8, but as I've gotten to be a scientist, I'm always very impressed how up to date it often is on the science. Like if you go back to the original series, for example, there's no mentions of genetics almost at all, which makes sense because we didn't really know that much about, say, molecular biology or genetics at the time when that aired. But when you look, present day, something like a quarter of episodes of Enterprise mention something genetics, and a lot of them talk about genomes and genome sequencing, and they actually refer to even studies sometimes. Like, wow, this is really on top of it. They actually have science advisors contributing to the content, which is very impressive.
And we'll talk about how accurate they are or not,
sometimes,
or they're not, as we go forward here. Yeah, but your work, of course, deals with a different sort of gene than most Trek fans would know. Not Gene Roddenberry, but in this case, biological genes, genetics, and evolutionary biology.
Yep.
And I've heard time and again stories of scientists, astronauts, people studying and working in STEM fields, that it was Star Trek and science fiction that initially sparked their interest in science and research. And I've talked to a few of them on this show. You talked about your sort of early love of science and your love of Star Trek. I mean, did that influence you to study genetics and where you're at now?
I wouldn't say it directly influenced me. It certainly reinforced the idea that it's okay to be nerdy, it's okay to love science and to like this idea of exploration. But I don't think there was a direct link between, say, watching Star Trek and deciding to go into biology or genetics. But like I said, it did reinforce it and it did validate it in the way, which was nice.
Most people who have gone through high school or gone through college and have studied biology are probably familiar with genetics through little plastic tubes, rotten bananas, and fruit flies. Can you talk about your work with fruit flies?
Oh, so actually I do work with fruit flies, as you mentioned. I'm very interested in what are the genetic changes that lead to the formation of new species. So why is it, for example, you have two fruit flies that maybe look identical and maybe in their DNA sequence they differ at only 1% of the letters that are there, but yet they're considered to be separate species. Maybe the hybrids are sterile, or maybe they preferentially mate with their own type. So we try to understand what are those changes and what are the evolutionary forces that cause them to come about.
Sure. And why are fruit flies a good way to teach students genetics?
Well, fruit flies are great because their life cycle is really fast. I mean, you can have the regular Drosophila melanogaster, the typical lab fly. You can have a generation in 10 days, which is great. I mean, there's often a myth people often out there say, like, don't fruit flies live one day? I don't know where that came from. That's absolutely not true.
Like the mayfly, or
I don't know. But as egg to adult is 10 days, and then they can live for a month or even more than that as an adult. But anyway, it's a fast generation time. They have a small genome, so it's easy to actually, I mean, this wasn't true initially, but now we can actually whole genome sequence them for almost nothing. They're just very easy to work with. And honestly, people don't care what you do to them. So if we kill a lot of them, it's okay.
Yeah, I always felt bad about having to put them to sleep and then sort of pour them out into a tray, and they're just so helpless there.
Yeah.
Are there any other insects or life forms that we also use in studies like this?
There are many model systems. So another popular one is called C. elegans. It's a very small worm and has a very quick life cycle. The interesting thing with that worm is it has males and hermaphrodites rather than males and females. And the hermaphrodites can actually self-fertilize, and that's what most of them are. They're just hermaphrodites and they self-fertilize. But every now and then they'll produce a male that can only fertilize the hermaphrodites. So that's one popular organism. There's a little weed that people use a lot. It's called a Arabidopsis. It's a plant. I think its generation time is like about a month or so. That's another very popular one. A lot of people work on yeast. Yeast are very fast. They don't have very interesting behaviors, though.
Right. Yeah. I know that this all got started with Gregor Mendel working with pea plants.
Yep.
Is that just what he had, or did he select pea plants specifically for some characteristic that they had?
I mean, I don't know for sure. I would assume it's just since they were in a monastery, they had a garden, they had peas, and he saw those interesting
That's what they
traits.
had.
Yep.
Right. Yeah. Well, and you can eat your science after you're done.
There you go.
Well, there's something I've been looking forward to asking you about, and
Sure.
I think we should probably do it right up top here. Last year on this show, we did an episode on the Voyager episode Threshold, an episode held by some to be the worst episode of Star Trek, although we do examine that claim fairly on the program. On the episode, we talked about a news story that had come out earlier in the year about a published scientific paper entitled Rapid Genetic and Developmental Morphological Change Following Extreme Celerity.
I'm very familiar with this paper.
Yeah, okay, all right. Well, tell me more. As a Star Trek fan with a good vocabulary myself, I immediately kind of got an inkling about where that might be going. But the journal that published the paper didn't know, I think, that it was essentially an examination of the events of the episode of Threshold.
Yep. That's exactly right.
The paper was published by the pseudonymous BioTrekkie, but BioTrekkie's contact email in the paper was lewiszimmermanufp@gmail.com, and I haven't gotten any responses from it.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah.
I know a lot about this paper. So just the title, as you mentioned, Rapid Genetic and Developmental Morphological Change Following Extreme Celerity. Celerity is just a fancy word for speed. And it's an interesting paper because if you go into the methods section, they're very explicit saying, we employed a replicated, as in more than one, design wherein 2 human subjects were exposed to theoretical maximum celerity, parentheses, warp 10. It actually says that in the paper.
All right.
And examined.
That's pretty explicit.
Then they have a whole bunch of measurements that were taken. And it's interesting, some of the things in the paper, basically the results section just recounts the episode scene by scene. So it says, for example, immediately following maximum celerity, human subjects exhibited somnolescence that was readily terminated with audible stimulation. Very fancy words, basically saying the human subject was asleep, and you were able to wake him up by yelling at him. Which, if you remember, is exactly what happened with the episode. Tom Paris was asleep, and the doctor said, "I think he's just asleep. Wake up, Mr. Paris," and woke him up.
Right.
Is that within a few hours, the subjects began to experience an unspecific general histamine response to normal environmental inputs. In other words, there was an allergic reaction to water and subsequent reduced neural activity, as in he temporarily died. And basically, again, it just recounts scene for scene everything that's in this particular episode. The other thing, I'm not sure if you mentioned this, but the authors of the paper are Tom Paris, Harry Kim, Balana Torres, Kes Ocampa, I guess she doesn't have a last name, Catherine Janeway, and Louis Zimmerman, who, as you remember, was the person who made the EMH hologram.
So the fact that this did get published is an example of not all that great peer review.
Peer review. I just happen to know the peer reviews that this thing actually received. Can't imagine how I would know that.
Yeah, I don't really know either, but we don't have to go into it. And a lot of journals publish papers like this without any real review, just for money. Are bogus or lax journals a recent problem, or has the scientific community always had to deal with them?
They're fairly recent. I mean, in the sense of decades recent, not recent like the last few months. What happened is about a little over maybe 10, 15 years ago, there was a movement that scientific papers should be open access. Basically, papers should be published in a way that anybody can be able to just see the scientific output without having to pay for the paper or pay for a subscription to the journal or be affiliated with a big university or something like that. That's a very good movement, and it's something I actually applaud very heavily. So the way for doing that is to move the cost. Obviously, there's a cost associated with publishing. To move the costs from, say, libraries and individuals who are subscribing to the person who's actually publishing the science. And you can get from your research grants from the National Institutes of Health or National Science Foundation money to help you publish science. So again, that part's all fine. But of course, people got wind of this idea that basically I can host a website, I can call it a journal, and I can charge people to put their science up there. So these are referred to as predatory scientific publications. And they do a minimal or no peer review. In the case of the paper you were just talking about, I mean, the required modifications from the author say the author should check punctuation. The author should illustrate the results with graphs and images. That is not a substantive set of reviews, given that we just said this person grew a new heart and evolved into a lizard.
Right. Yeah, I think that we've gone to something, though. I'd love to see a website, not that tells you right away that it's not for real, but that does this, like publishes scientific-style papers on specific Star Trek episodes. I think that there's could be a future for entertainment, of course, not for scientific purposes.
Of course. I would love that too. I might contribute some.
Well, okay. Well, I'll let you know. They're in the process of announcing several new Trek series, and I think it'd be a mistake to not go back and explore what happened to those salamander babies.
Yeah. It was kind of interesting that their whole purpose is to seek out new life. They're like, oh, there it is. All right, bye.
Okay, we saw it. We gotta go.
Done. Like, do they even get scans of it? I mean, I don't know. We didn't really see.
Yeah, I think Tuvok says it all because he's basically like, I just don't want to talk about it. I don't want to know about it. Let's just get out of here.
Yep.
Not very scientific.
That was a kind of a ridiculous episode in many respects. And it's interesting. It illustrates the kind of thing that comes up in so much science fiction, especially with regard to mutations. So they talked about how these mutations came about. And this is in so much sci-fi where you see, obviously in comics too, when you think about Marvel with the quote unquote the mutants. You know, when you think of a mutation, mutations are like a random change somewhere in your whole genome. So we have 3.1 billion of those DNA letters in our genome times 2. We have one copy from mom, one copy from dad. If there's a random change, the odds of that thing giving you superpowers or making something that's in any way good is infinitesimally low. I mean, the most likely thing, if you're going to have a bunch of mutations happen in some skin cells, for example, the most likely outcome is either nothing or they turn cancerous, you know, something like that.
Or cancer.
Yeah. But the idea that you would have things like mutations that happen not just in one cell, but in all your cells, and somehow they're complementary and they work together in such a way that you can suddenly then change to a reptile or amphibian, or I think it was amphibian in that case. That's absurd. But this comes up so much in science fiction. I don't know why.
Yeah. You also bring up, and you brought up the X-Men, so I feel comfortable sliding over to that. You bring up in your book, Live Long and Evolve, what the misconception that genetics are leading somewhere.
Yeah.
That they aren't just, you know, a sort of a paring down of features or genes based on the environment. And that's something else that comes up in the X-Men franchise as well, is that, you know, mutants are the next level of human evolution. Like, you know, one day we'll all be mutants, but right now that's very scary for regular people.
Yeah, directionality in evolution is a big thing. People tend to think that, like, oh, this is the next step. This, like you said, this comes up all the time. We have no idea what the next step will be, because that implies that we know what the environment will be in the future. It implies we know the effects of a particular mutation. You know, that's so infinitesimally unlikely that would never happen. But I mean, on the other hand, I mean, this is an entertainment franchise. It's not like an episode of Nova or Scientific American. So, you know, fair enough.
Sure, right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, what was the impetus for putting together your book, Live Long and Evolve?
That's a great question. So I had observed a colleague of mine give, his name is Eric Spanda. He's a professor here at Duke University. I observed him give a talk on the science behind Mass Effect at a convention at DragonCon back in 2014. He also gives a very popular talk on the genetics of wizarding in Harry Potter, and uses this to engage students and convention folks and all sorts of other venues about that. And I thought, wow, this is great. I could potentially do something like that with Star Trek. So I spoke with Garrett Wong, who's Harry Kim from Star Trek Voyager, about doing that at DragonCon. And he said, sure, I'd have you give talks on things like that. So I given talks, kind of like a couple of the chapters in the book. And at that point, I was approached shortly after that from the publisher, this is Princeton University Press, asking if I had an idea for a talk for the general public in an associated book. Well, I have a couple of talks I give to the general public. One of them is on evidence for evolution, but my former PhD advisor, Jerry Coyne, already wrote a book called Why Evolution is True. And that's, you know, it's fairly new. It's very, very good. I didn't want to try to compete with it. I don't think I could write anything that was better than what he wrote. So she said, well, do you have anything else you do for the general public? I said, well, there is something. It's kind of out there. And I pitched the idea to her, and she went with it. Kudos to her.
That's great. I've talked to a lot of academics on this show who utilize Star Trek in their curriculum. Have you ever used Live Long in any of your classes?
So right now I'm teaching a class called Genetics, Evolution, Star Trek, and this is the textbook for that class.
Wow, well, sign me up.
Yeah, it's great. It's a non-major course, and actually it's been a lot of fun just in trying to engage students. Now, honestly, most college students haven't seen any or certainly not much Star Trek, but it's just interesting doing it with, you know, some sort of science fiction. And what we do is, you know, on one of the days we'll watch, say, for example, part of an episode, and then we'll talk about like, oh, okay, well, this depicted this, you know, this particular scene. You know, maybe they use the word dominant. What does that mean? Do they use it correctly? Oh, look, there's a horda. It's silicon based. Why is that possible? Why is that not possible? We use that as a way of engaging But we've also tried to connect it to a sort of a societal angle. For example, we on the first day of class, we interviewed Andre Bormanis on Skype, and he was the science advisor for part of Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, things like that. And he told us a lot about the behind the scenes and how he did the research to figure out how to portray things. And he talked about compromises he had to do at times because, the plot had to go in this direction and there wasn't a scientific way to do it. So, all right, I'm going to just twist a term and stick it in there and hope for the best.
Yeah. When I went to school, it was different, I think, than it is now. We had the teacher would lecture, we had textbooks and handwritten notes and highlighters, and now many schools have digital learning tools. Kids are getting iPads. You've got new techniques like flipped classrooms and online learning, and you can Skype with your professor. How do you see the classroom of the 21st century continuing to change as the years progress?
It's very hard to predict ahead of time. It's interesting you mentioned flipped classes, for example. My other class, not the Genetics Evolution Trek, but my other class that I teach, this is just a basic introduction to genetics and evolution, is a flipped class. I think that works well for some venues, but honestly, flipped classes are basically what English professors have been doing all along. I mean, it's not like you go into an English class and the professor pulls up a book of Shakespeare and just starts reading it to the class. But there's an expectation that outside of class, you've already read it, you've already thought about it, and now coming to class, we're going to discuss it. And that basically is the principle of the flipped class. So it's a fancy set of words, but honestly, it's something that was there for, almost 100 years, or if not more, in some sense.
Sure.
It's not so much in the sciences.
Something that we haven't really touched on this program previously is the state of learning in Star Trek's future. We see some children using very simple, AOL kids computers on Picard's Enterprise, and we see Keiko's schoolroom on DS9, and we see Hoshi teaching exolinguistics, but we don't see many classrooms over the course of the various series. How would you theorize that learning would be different in the 24th century? I mean, they would have access to much different tools than we do today.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine because at this point we already have, I mean, just now in the last 20 years, we have access to basically all the knowledge of humanity at our fingertips. It's hard to know, how do you build from that? What can be more than all the knowledge in humanity just literally at your fingertips? I mean, I guess if there was some way to just immediately insert it into your brain. That might
right, like, data tapes. Yeah, right.
Yeah. You have a USB port on the side of your head.
That's something that, and we have talked about that, about how mind-machine interface is something that Trek has just sort of steered away from, and it's something that really concerns us today in our fiction and in our scientific development as well.
Yeah, no, agreed.
But that's not genetics. We'll keep it to genetics and education. And with the unlimited resources that the Federation has, I would imagine that the nature or the purpose of education would change, because anybody can theoretically, with enough education and skill, do anything. There's no competition in a sort of capitalist market. You could have free tuition, and everyone would have access to education, not just monetarily, but also geographically. You could just learn from home, I'd imagine. So hopefully education would be dedicated to satisfying the specific needs of any student. I mean, you could really, no child would be left behind, literally, if you had unlimited money and time and class size.
Yeah, it makes sense. And especially, like you said, it's a cashless society. So, there's no need to pay for it. Everybody should have access. It's true.
Yeah, you'd really have to want to drop out, if you wanted in their society. Well, from Khan to clones to Jem'Hadar to the Xindi, Trek has explored storytelling potential of genetics and evolution since its inception. And something that I found fascinating that you talk about in your book is that the science of genetics was evolving, of course, right alongside the franchise of Trek. In the 60s, that we were still trying to crack the genetic code, but as real world science progresses, we start to see it more in Trek plots, like in TNG.
Definitely.
And there's this argument, at least in my head, where we always wonder if Trek is predicting things like flip phones and iPads and Skype, or if it's influencing the inventors and engineers who push technology in that direction. And for me, the way that Trek uses genetics and evolutionary biology kind of settles that debate for me, at least for that particular field, in that the Trek writers are great writers, but they're not scientists or prognosticators, and their understanding of those genetic ideas runs a bit behind our contemporary understanding. They can get a flip phone right, but they're kind of making it up when they talk about rewriting DNA or gene transfer.
No, it's true. There's definitely times when it's a stretch. Sometimes it's based on something that's right, but maybe it's not absolutely current. Because, like you said, again, they're not geneticists, they're not scientists. So they'll go from things that you could tell where maybe they caught a press release. I'll give you one example from Star Trek Discovery, since that's the current series right now.
Sure.
They talk a lot about this in the first season. They talk a lot about this tardigrade. And obviously, it wasn't a real tardigrade because this is this big spacefaring thing. It wasn't the microscopic organism that we have here on Earth.
Right.
But they commented that the tardigrade has this ability to ride the mycelial network, which, by the way, I'm not touching that whole mycelial network thing. That's way out there.
Fair enough. Okay.
But they say its ability to do that comes from having extensive amounts of horizontal gene transfer. What that is basically acquiring genes from other species into your own genome. This is known to happen. And interestingly, in 2015 or 16, there was a study from some researchers at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which actually had identified or had sequenced the first tardigrade genome and had found what they thought was extensive evidence for horizontal gene transfer. So that was really cool that they incorporated that into there. However, there was a study the next year, well before the Discovery episode, which showed that the researchers had actually made a mistake. And in fact, it did not have high rates of horizontal gene transfer at all. That probably didn't have press releases associated with it. So
Yeah.
they were going off the
It's
press
never
release
quite as
off-
exciting to refute something than it is to announce
No,
something.
exactly. So that was it was a good attempt. I'll put it that way.
Are there other organisms that do show signs of gene transfer in the way that they were thinking that the tardigrade did?
Well, I mean, the tardigrade may have some, but it just doesn't have an unusually high amount of it. Certainly,
As much
bacteria
as-
have
okay.
plenty. Bacteria swap
Sure.
stuff all the time. This is part of how antibiotic resistance can go from one
Okay.
bacteria to another bacteria. It's through
Sure.
sort of horizontal gene transfer. Yeah.
You have a section in your book where you rate some of the plots from Trek that deal with genetics or evolutionary biology, and you rate them as either gems or coal. That is,
That's right.
basically right or wrong,
Yep,
but
yep.
being kind. And I had a few examples of my own that I'm sure you were saving for the follow-up, but maybe I could run
Sure.
them by you.
Sure.
Something that's a mainstay of science fiction and Trek in particular is cloning. Somebody's always getting cloned, and I had two examples that I was wondering about. In the TNG episode Up the Long Ladder, some of the Enterprise crew members are cloned from non-specialized cells, and then the development of the clones is accelerated, so they're essentially mature. Now, this is, of course, science fiction, but would that be something feasible with real-world science to age up a clone, or do they have to grow up the old-fashioned way?
I mean, right now, we would have to do it the old-fashioned way for sure. But is it conceivable that there's some way to accelerate it by, inserting a bunch of nutrients and trying to speed up the process? I'm sure there are some actual physical constraints, just in the sense that, like, molecules will only assemble X speed. But I'm sure there is a way to accelerate in some way. So that probably is at least somewhat true.
Yeah. I think in Star Trek Nemesis, and the less said about Nemesis, the better. They literally they have this clone of Picard, played by Tom Hardy, who will eventually grow to look like Captain Picard. And I think they just put the word temporal in front of DNA or RNA.
They did.
Well,
they did.
That's how they'll do it.
It's interesting to me. Isn't Nemesis exactly the same as Wrath of Khan? I mean, in so many ways. Here's this person who's, kind of the nemesis of the captain. There's this long plot of him wanting to get back at him. There's a beloved character who dies at the end. There's I mean, in some ways, it basically is Wrath of Khan, but next generation.
Yeah. They share a lot of the same DNA.
Yeah, there you go.
Something else we see a lot with clones in sci-fi is they're often an exact copy containing all the memories and experiences of the host. And Trek kind of waffles on this. Sometimes a clone is a new person, sometimes they're the same. I guess I was looking for your thoughts on the debatable concept of genetic memory. That is, there being some aspect of memory that's either chemical or related to genetics.
I mean, certainly no direct memory should be in there. And there are some ridiculous ones. So, for example, there was an episode of Enterprise where they made Sim from Trip Tucker. And as Sim was growing, he was then remembering different things from Trip's life. That didn't make any sense. And, this was made by getting some DNA from, like, Trip's neck or blood or something like that.
Right.
That made no sense whatsoever. On the other hand, if you remember the clone of Kalis didn't actually have Kalis's memories. And they said they had to actually, put an imprint of those memories onto there. So that was a pretty good illustration there. But I mean, your question is broader than that. Your question is like, can there be some sort of genetic memory? I mean, with the kind of inheritance we have right now, I mean, you have to think about it this way. Imagine that, me as an adult experiences something. How would that get passed on to my offspring? Obviously, if I teach them, that's one thing. But how would that affect the DNA in my sperm cells? It's really hard to imagine a way that would be true. Something like starvation, that may have, I mean, that's not a memory in the sense of like I saw something and I'm remembering it, but something like starvation, that may affect some chemical modifications of the DNA, which potentially could have some sort of effect that may go one generation. But actual memories of events, no, I don't think so.
Right, like it depends on when your child is conceived. Like you learn to juggle, one weekend, and then the next weekend your child is conceived, and now your child would learn how to juggle. But your earlier children, I guess, wouldn't know how to juggle. Yeah, and it doesn't make any sense. But it's funny. I don't know why science fiction authors keep using it. It just seems like it's so. It's just obviously contradicted by what we know.
Yeah. Even if it wasn't for the timing aspect, it just doesn't make sense. Like, how does this get into the DNA of your sperm cells?
Yeah.
I mean,
in the DS9 episode, The Quickening, the Dominion has released a genetically engineered virus onto a planet that causes painful lesions and 100% mortality, and it's passed directly to the offspring. Babies are born infected with the virus. Dr. Bashir develops an antigen against the virus that fails to save the infected patients, but it transmits immunity to the disease through a patient's unborn child. So is the founder's virus changing the DNA of the sufferers? Or, if Bashir had the technology available, would he be able to use a technique like in utero gene therapy to make other fetuses immune?
That's exactly what I think it is. It's the latter. It would make a lot of sense to me that in some way it's directly affecting basically what's in the gametes. Because then it makes sense because there's a much smaller number of things that you have to work with than as opposed to having to try to work with every single cell in somebody's body. If you work with the gametes, that's it. It's getting passed on.
Yeah. Also, the virus is said to mutate rapidly in the presence of EM fields or energy sources. Other than the completely real Andromeda strain, are there any other examples of rapid mutation in the real world viruses?
Oh, absolutely. Like HIV is one of has extremely high mutation rate, and that's one of the reasons. Actually, it's very easy to track who somebody got it from by getting the sequence from the RNA, because you can then see, this clearly came from this individual right there because of its very high mutation rate. On the other hand, it also makes it's also one of the reasons why it's very hard to fight it off, because it does mutate so rapidly. It's hard to get antibodies that work directly on it all the time.
Well, speaking of Dr. Bashir, he was, of course, radically altered genetically when he was a child. And thanks to negative historical experiences that we mentioned previously in the Star Trek universe, genetic engineering has been banned in most cases. As real-world examples of human genetic engineering begin to proliferate, how do you see public opinion and governmental legislation coping with that?
That's a great question, because, again, like you said, this is not a technological problem anymore. At this point, we could actually start. I mean, I don't know about people talk about designer babies, and I don't think we're at the point where you can say, I want to have a baby who's blonde and smart and do a genetic editing to make that happen. We're not there yet, but we are definitely the case where you can say that, this baby has, for example, sickle cell anemia. Or sorry, this person has the potential to have a baby who has sickle cell anemia. I'm going to go through and edit their gametes to make sure that their kid doesn't get that. That's very doable. And it's interesting in cases like that. I think public perception will probably be very positive. Well, yeah, of course. Why would we want to force the kid to have sickle cell anemia? So that in that sense, it seems very positive, but it's a very quick slippery slope in the sense of like, okay, how bad does it have to be before you actually say it's okay to intervene? Does it have to be directly life-threatening? What if it's livelihood-threatening? What if the kid is going to be perceived as ugly? That's a dis-ease, if not a disease. So it's gonna take a very long and tough conversation, because now all of a sudden we have the ability to do this thing that it's a little earth-shattering in some senses if you go too far with it. I think it's one of the things, as is always the case, there's going to be like there's black and white, and then there's a very long area of gray in the middle.
Voyager has an episode called Tuvix, where a transporter accident fuses Tuvok and Neelix into a Gestalt being they dubbed Tuvix. Would Tuvix be an example of a genetic chimera?
So I wouldn't call them a chimera. I think it's more like what you refer to as a polyploid, because a chimera is kind of like, some of the cells are one type and some of the cells are a different type. But in the case of Tuvix, my understanding was that every cell had all of Tuvok's genes and all of Neelix's genes. And there are cases where two species, this is fairly common in plants. It happens with a couple of animals, but not nearly so often, though, where two species will hybridize and they make something, instead of having just one copy from this species, one copy from that species, they actually have two of each. So basically like double their overall genome size. That does happen. It's kind of surprising that it works. And in fact, those are often unusually healthy relative to normal hybrids. So unlike, for example, say a horse and donkey, where their offspring is mule and sterile, when you have these polyploid events, very often they're fertile and quite vigorous. So a lot of the crop plants that we work with all the time. Various kinds of wheat and cotton, things like that. Those are polyploids.
And so when it happens with plants, as you mentioned, it leads to a strong and robust thing. But of course, if something like that happened in animals, that would be probably not a good thing.
It does happen. I mean, it's known in frogs. It's known in fish. I don't think it's known with any mammals. So that would be problematic.
Yeah. Okay. I played a little game of Stump Memory Alpha while getting ready for this talk. I was just entering every term I remembered from my college courses in genetics and seeing if something came up. And I was impressed. They've covered a lot of topics in terms of genetics, or at least at a basic level.
Memory Alpha was wonderful for me when I was writing the book.
You've done the research literally. Can you say which Star Trek series uses plot lines about genetics the most?
Oh, it's interesting that I didn't assess Discovery because it's still in process, but I did analysis of use of the word genes and things like that, and it was almost linear going across there. Where the least mentions were in the original series. Deep Space Nine and Next Generation were pretty overlapping. There was a little step up with Voyager, and there was another step up with Enterprise in terms of the fraction of episodes. So it just seems like the more recent you get, the more genetics you have.
Yeah. Is there a standout episode for you that really nails the science of what it's trying to tackle?
Well, I mean, if they're using basic genetic terms, then generally speaking, most of the episodes do a pretty good job. So, for example, in Voyager, the episode Favorite Son, which is in the 3rd season, that's the one where Ensign Kim gets convinced that he's actually a Teresian or something like that. And they talk about dominance and recessivity and things like that. And their descriptions are fine. There's a couple little nitpicky things I'd say, but generally speaking, it's pretty good. I liked the episode where Seska was found out to be a Cardassian rather than a Bajoran too. I can't remember the name of that episode. Was it State of Flux? I think it was State of Flux in Voyager. So. Yeah, that was interesting too because in that particular episode, they said that she was missing all the common Bajoran blood factors. I'm assuming they did this through some sort of DNA test, not a blood test, but I'm not sure. And interestingly, her response to that was that she had some sort of disease when she was a child, and she received a bone marrow transplant from a Cardassian. Which is a little bit ironic. I'm not sure why you would get a bone marrow transplant from an alien, but whatever. It seems like they find a Bajoran to do it. But anyway, but that idea was pretty good because in that sense that bone marrow actually makes blood cells. So if you got a bone marrow transplant from a Cardassian, then it's true. Some of your blood cells should have these Cardassian factors in that. So that was actually pretty good. Turned out that wasn't the case, but that was a decent idea though.
Yeah. I think they do establish, too, that there is a fairly recent common genetic ancestor between the Bajorans and the Cardassians as well.
Well, that depends on which episode you go by. If you go by the chase, it's not so recent.
Well, that's farther back. Yeah, definitely. But just with the proximity of their systems, and then I think it's in Explorers where they prove out the idea about the light ships and being able to go around before the technology got up there. Something else that we're talking about it right now. Something else you touch on in the book is the prevalence of humanoid aliens in Trek, which Trek tries to address in The Chase, which specifically states that a humanoid ancestor species seeded some of the origin worlds of the show's familiar species with genetic material. But you, in the book, take that idea to task, and you point out some implausibilities in that idea.
Oh, absolutely. So that's it's a nice idea in the sense that it incorporates this idea of panspermia, which is the idea that life on Earth was, seeded from elsewhere in the universe. And, that idea in and of itself is plausible. We know there's amino acids that are found in extraterrestrial meteors when they land on Earth as meteorites. So, I can imagine some raw materials coming to Earth that may have led to humans. But this idea that, humans and Romulans and Klingons share an ancestor 4 billion years ago. That's absurd. We're just way, way, way too similar for that. I mean, we're more closely related to grass than we are to Klingons. And we're certainly not making hybrids with grass. That's just an absurd idea. What I thought worked a little bit better was the episode in the original series, the Paradise Syndrome, where they said there was some ancient species which was picking up primitive cultures that were in. Yeah, exactly. They were picking up cultures in danger of extinction and seeding them where they could live and grow. So in that case, they picked up this little group of Native Americans and they brought them to this planet Amarand, which is a little bit strange, but that's okay.
Yeah. Or actors playing white actors playing Native Americans.
Or that, which is more accurate. But now, if that had happened, say for example, with say Homo erectus, maybe a couple 100,000 years ago. Yeah, sure. Maybe it may have evolved forehead ridges or pointy ears or something like that over that time, but still be interfertile. So that would actually work fairly reasonably.
Yeah, I guess they overstepped then with the billions of years, because that would be
Yeah,
a
4
crazy
billion
amount
is
of convergent
way.
evolution.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's no way.
uh, in the book, you also reference Stephen Gould's comments about panspermia and just the idea that there are so many various chance events in
That's
an
right.
environment or in the development of a biosphere that
Yep.
could change. The final result that we're looking at, just the asteroid impacts on Earth clearly developed or changed who would be the dominant species on the planet.
Exactly.
And I just looking at that, like, I'd love to see, if that episode went on for 2 more minutes, a race of dinosaur men beams in and they're like, hey, we got this weird program.
Maybe the Voth, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Somebody showed up.
The chase is a pretty good episode, all in all, though. And even if
Absolutely.
you explained why it'd be unlikely, but it's a
Yeah.
cool idea. And Trek has a lot of plots about evolution and genetics. But
Yep.
like we said before, it often kind of gets it wrong. Why do you think
Yeah.
that the stories about genetic engineering and genetics are so popular, but they're so rarely scientifically accurate?
Well, people like the idea of genetics in general, right? I mean, genetics is very modern, and it's a way we seek to understand ourselves. So in that sense, it's really cool. I mean, I'm maybe being a little too picky when I say they often get it wrong. They don't often get it wrong, but there's often errors. But I think part of it is just because they want to maintain a particular storyline. They want to have a particular kind of thing, and basically, the writers are constrained where, like, this is the outcome we want to have. There's not a way to do it fairly easily with good science, so we'll just put in some pseudoscience in there to push it forward.
Yeah. Okay. Science fiction. Right.
Exactly.
I think most of the aliens that we meet on Star Trek are humanoid. They have 2
Yep.
legs.
Yep.
You put some silly putty on their forehead and we're ready to go. And I think
Yep.
that the practical answer is that, the actors have to be humanoid. But would it be foolish for us to expect alien life to look kind of like us? Like, is the bilateral symmetry and all the aspects and characteristics of a human being, would that be likely to be repeated, do you think?
No.
No. Okay, there we go.
I
So
really don't
it's
think
all
so.
Hortas. It's Hortas all the way down.
That's horizontal. I mean, realistically, if we look at even life on Earth, the most common forms of life are microscopic. I've often
Sure.
joked about that with the idea of SETI, that people are like transmitting, radio signals into space. I mean, that's fine, and maybe that will work. I guess if it's not expensive, we may as well keep trying that. But we're way more likely to find life going to Europa and sampling some of the liquid there and trying to find some microbial life than we are for somebody to radio back and be like, "Hey, I got your call."
Yeah, right. You up? Yeah.
Yep.
Aliens often come in different colors too on Trek. If we
Yeah.
do meet an alien race that's carbon based, uses hemoglobin to oxygenate their blood, and they're from an M-class planet, should we expect them to be pinkish like us, or are there just many environmental factors that would lead to a blue or a green person?
I think there's no way to know ahead of time, because a lot of it's going to depend on the specifics about not only
I
just their
appreciate your
environment, but what's
pragmatism.
possible.
Yeah. All right. Well, then get the box of crayons out and let's go crazy. Then
There you go.
Purple it is. Biology is just gooey physics from a certain point of view, biophysics. So there's certain rules that we can expect organic molecules to follow, assuming that we're looking for life similar to us. But if it's nothing like us, as you suggest, how do we even conceptualize then non-humanoid intelligent life? We see that even Kirk and Spock in the 23rd century have a problem with that when they meet the Horta.
Yeah, that was true. And so there's 2 aspects there. I'll split your question into 2. So one of them is basically life's not as we know it, and the other part is whether it's intelligent. And I'd say those are very different questions, because it's much more likely that it's not intelligent than it is, at least by our definitions of intelligence. So it's interesting, like, how do you identify something as being alive or having come from something alive? And this is an active area of research right now. A lot of the current efforts, these are by people who are much smarter than me, who are biochemists, biophysicists, things like that. A lot of the current efforts focus on complexity. That basically, there's a certain set of rules, like you said, that needs to be followed. But generally speaking, life tends to be a little bit more complex than non-life, and in certain kind of predictable ways. And there's formula you can apply to that, and that's exactly the kind of approach that people are proposing to use when you say, for example, have a lander go to Europa, and to assess if something is sitting in front of you, like there's this little thing that looks like hair gel. Is it alive or is it not alive? Is it just one repeating set of molecules and that's it for the entire thing? Probably not alive. On the other hand, if it has a structure to it, but it's not just a simple repeat, then maybe that's a little bit more likely. And you can have this, you can basically make a probability of life from the complexity.
Interesting. That's kind of troublesome then in the episode The Devil in the Dark, that they immediately assume that it's alive, clearly, but it's not intelligent. And I wonder if they have a policy of just like, this is in the way of our mining operation, wipe it out until they are literally confronted with it, begging them not to kill it.
Yeah.
And they're like,
what was it? No kill eye or something like that?
No kill eye. That's right. We should be sending that by SETI, yeah. As a sci-fi fan as a kid, something that always blew my mind was reading things like Barlowe's Guide to Extraterrestrials and seeing aliens that just didn't have two legs or two arms or had radial symmetry instead of bilateral symmetry, and just trying to conceptualize aliens in a different form than the red, blue, green, purple people that we see on TV.
Yeah, no, I agreed completely.
Well, before we wrap up, I wanted to get some of your thoughts on the way Star Trek Discovery is using science in its stories. And science seems to be a real focus for the series, with exobiology, exomycology, parallel realities all making appearances. The Spore Drive is the big ask here from a scientific perspective. I think you say in the book that the idea is creative, which is fairly diplomatic.
Yeah, I think so. I think they've all been infected with mycophilia.
Okay.
They love fungi way too much. Now, if you go back, actually, we can tell where this came from. So, if you go back, there's a TED talk from, I forget exactly the year, something like 2012, by a scientist named Paul Stamets. Interesting name, because that overlaps the astromycologist in Star Trek Discovery. And there's a lot, if you watch that TED Talk, there's a lot from that particular TED Talk that is actually directly worked into the series. So again, they're using some scientists' information to work in there. And I know this directly influenced Brian Fuller because he tweeted about it way back in like 2015 or something like that, long before Discovery came out. So clearly that was the direct impetus going into Star Trek Discovery. Yeah. It gets, as is usually the case with Star Trek, it gets, or with science fiction in general, it gets taken further. So probably the most problematic aspect is this idea, like, why should there be fungal spores everywhere in the universe? They use that word universe all the time. The universe is really, really, really big. Why would there be fungal spores everywhere when these fungi evolved here on Earth? Like, what blasted them out so that they're literally on every galaxy? Yeah. I mean, that doesn't make any sense at all. So
and the spores, the Stella Viatori spores that they talk about are fictional, but their genus, Prototaxites, is real. So
that's exactly right.
So we can presume, like you said, that they do have an origin, a terrestrial origin, which puts Earth in a very strange, very central position in the biogeography of the universe. Yeah. If we've got this spore that is everywhere, presumably in our universe, definitely in this other universe, this mycelial realm, like why? What happened?
I have no idea. I don't think there's any good explanation there. I think there is just, it's just a lot of, like you said, creativity.
Oh, sure.
To their credit, again, it is science fiction, so fair enough.
And I think it's wonderful. Yeah, and I think it's wonderful that they've taken an idea. It's not just another warp ship that's flying around. We've seen that before. Exactly. I love the fact that they're doing something really crazy. Even the inclusion of a space tardigrade is something that, it's really neat to see.
It was neat to have a tardigrade in particular, just because, those are things that can, withstand extreme temperatures, extreme pressures, things like that. People often say tardigrades can survive in space. If you go back to the original papers that describe that, it's not like they usually survive in space-like conditions. It's just 100% of them don't all die,
Right. It's a nice place to visit that they don't live there. Right. Yeah. Well, before we go, I wanted to ask you about the popularity of these home genetic testing kits like 23andMe and just how you feel in general about the accuracy, the safety and privacy concerns involved with them.
That's a great question. So, the accuracy it's interesting with respect to where people are from. So in terms of lineages, people often used to say, oh, I'm, this much French origin, this much Native American origin, this much East Asian origin. It's interesting because your genes and your lineage are not necessarily the same thing. Like, for example, you could have an ancestor 10 generations back who was Native American and have absolutely no DNA whatsoever from that ancestor. So this is relevant, for example, in the recent political discussions in terms of, say, Elizabeth Warren. I mean, you could have an answer like that, but I mean, you could have literally no genes from them. Obviously, if it's like your parents, then you're going to have it. Even if it's your grandparents, you're going to have some DNA from them. But as you go further and further back, eventually you start getting to the point where like the contribution was so small, and maybe it just got, basically you just lost it a couple of generations back, or your ancestor lost that bit a couple of generations back, and you just didn't inherit it. So that's one aspect with that. In terms of health, most genetic factors we know associated with disease have very, very small effects. There are exceptions to that. So, for example, the BRCA1 and BRCA2 mutations associated with breast cancer. This is what Angelina Jolie was famously tested for and made, a fairly big decision based on her profile for that. That's uncommon. It's much more likely if you get a genetic test and says that you have a predisposition to a disease. It's like, okay, you have a 3% higher chance of getting this disease or something like that. And, it's a little bit worrisome that people may overinterpret that. Like, you're still way more likely to die by getting hit by a car than getting this disease that you're concerned about. So I think that's part of the reason I think the FDA came down on 23andMe and saying, like, you're giving them too much information, and people are not, they don't have the background necessary to interpret this as well as that. And as a result of that, 23andMe now has scaled back dramatically the amount of information they give in terms of health risks because of that. And most of what they do report now are sort of those big effect things like the BRCA1, BRCA2 popular mutations. Privacy aspects are really big too, because like you said, I mean, there is this Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which was passed into law back in 2008, that, for example, employers can't require you to take a genetic test. They can't, they can't use information from a genetic test. Insurers can't demand a genetic test, things like that. But it's specific in terms of where that's applied. So, for example, I don't believe that GINA affects long-term care insurance. And imagine, for example, some insurer gets a hold of a genetic test and says you're predisposed to getting Alzheimer's. They're probably really not going to want to give you long-term insurance. So that, I believe, would not be covered. And honestly, there's always a chance that GINA could go away. I know some lawmakers have recently pushed for scaling back parts of GINA. So
okay, great.
You never know what will happen in the future. So it's definitely something to be aware of and cautious about.
Well, now I'm worried.
No, or more. The punchline I was going to say, I paused right then. What I was about to say is that realistically, though, I mean, I don't see people using most of that information because it's a lot of effort to get it and interpret it from even the other side. From to misuse it still takes a lot of effort too, at least right now. So I think in the short run, it's probably going to be fine. I just worry more of what things are going to be like a decade from now.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot on this show about things like big data and just corporations, utilizing and making money off of people's data, collecting it en masse, and not necessarily even knowing what they can use it for. But once they've got it, and then they can sort of implement it in whatever scheme they've got going on later.
Yep.
Excellent. So anyway, protect yourself.
Yes,
that's the rule. Well, Dr. Noor, thanks so much for joining me today for this talk. It's been fascinating, and I think it's really interesting to see real-world examples of some of the things that are explored in Star Trek. Let people know where they can find you online.
Sure. I'm on Twitter at MAF, like Frank Noor, and like November OOR. And you can also just Google my Duke University website. If you just Google my name, Mohamed Noor, and like November OOR.
Great. And where can people get your book, Live Long and Evolve?
I think it's pretty much at any bookseller. It's on Amazon. There's an audiobook version on Audible.
I'll leave a link in the show notes where people can find the book. And it really is a fascinating read, and you make it very fun and digestible.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you. Thanks for interviewing me, too. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Thanks again to Dr. Noor for talking with me. He is a very accomplished scientist and educator, and he's got no business talking to me and my 2-Bit podcast, but I really appreciate it, and it's fascinating. I think the science behind Star Trek is what makes it great, or one of the things that makes it great. I was actually having a Twitter exchange with Trek Facts on Twitter that we've talked about before on the show, and he was telling me that the show was originally kind of pitched as possibly being a balloon show. I've talked about this on this show, the idea that Gulliver's Travels was a big inspiration, and so at one point Roddenberry was trying to pitch to Herb Solo that they were going to he was going to fly. Captain Gulliver would fly from island to island, in his balloon and find all these weird lands. And it's like, it could have been a good show, but I think that this is probably the way to go. The sci-fi approach to that pitch. Because that way we have aliens and we can speculate on their genetics and all that kind of fun stuff, which is what Dr. Noor does in his book, Live Long and Evolve, What Star Trek Can Teach Us About Evolution, Genetics, and Life on Other Worlds. And it's a fascinating book and it's a fun read. He really picks apart, in a good way, some of the Trek episodes from every era and kind of goes over their science, what they get right, what they don't. But like I said in the interview, he's a little too nice sometimes, but he's an educator. He is encouraging. He's not trying to smack you down. So you definitely need to check out this book, and you can. I've got a link to the book in our show notes. Click that link or click through our Amazon banner on enterprisingindividuals.com. When you click through our links or our banner on enterprisingindividuals.com and you shop on Amazon, a percentage of your transaction comes back to us at no extra cost to you and helps keep the Warp Core lit here. And this counts for anything. It's not just Star Trek stuff. In fact, you can bookmark the banner, and when you click through to Amazon that way, whatever you buy, the same deal applies. It's a great way to help support the show. Anytime you shop on Amazon, click through enterprisingindividuals.com and shop away. And maybe you're saying, I don't need a book on Star Trek and genetics. I'm BioTrekkie. To which I would say, I don't think you're BioTrekkie. I can't really say how I know, but I'm pretty sure you're not. But I'd also say, if you like what you hear on Enterprising Individuals and you want to support the show, why not head to our Patreon page at patreon.com/EISTpod. It's there that you can sign up to be a crew member for the show for a small monthly amount, and you can get access to exclusive subscriber content. You can sign up at either the $1 level or the $5 level. If you want to throw us $1 a month, that's just $12 a year. You'll join our crew at the cadet level, which means you get access to our subscriber content, including live shows, like our live show with Measure of a Man writer Melinda Snodgrass at last year's Convergence. You also get my DS9 rewatch recaps, which are starting back up again this year. And new for this year, God help me, my Star Trek Voyager recaps. That's right, we're headed to both the Gamma Quadrant and now the Delta Quadrant as well, and you can hear all of that if you're a subscriber. If you subscribe at the $5 level, you can join our crew at the rank of Ensign, and you get access to the rewards from previous tiers. Plus, you get access to some of our newest features this year. Sometimes my guests are so engaging that our talks go significantly beyond the 1 hour mark that we usually try to keep them to. And sometimes our conversations go far afield from the subject of Star Trek. $5 subscribers to our Patreon will get to hear the outtakes from those interviews, stuff that was a real hoot, but it didn't make the cut. So if you want to hear David George talking about the Robert Durst case, or Alan Gratz and I talking about who's the best X-Man, or just hours of me begging David Mack to spill his secrets about his various Trek projects, then this is the tier for you. You also get access to Stellar Commentaries, our feature where we riff on classic episodes of the original series. I love the original series, but I mean, it can get pretty goofy sometimes, and we're recording audio tracks that you can play along with your copy of an episode, kind of riff track style. And if that somehow wasn't enough, if you contribute at the $5 level, you'll get sneak peeks at what's coming up on the show. You'll receive Enterprising Individual stickers and a welcome letter, and we'll thank you live on air for your contribution. Like our newest patron, Judy Unish. Judy joined the show at the $5 tier at the rank of Ensign. Welcome, Judy. And full disclosure, Judy is my aunt, so I may outrank her, but it doesn't mean I have any authority over her. I think the standard unit of donation is the price of a cup of coffee, right? So for the price of one latte a month, you can join our Ensign tier. For the price of a latte slowly sipped over the course of 6 months, you can become a cadet. So please consider contributing to the show. We currently have a monthly goal, which, if reached, I'll do a Patreon Q&A episode, and we'll have a poll for a listener-selected episode that we will actually cover on the show. So get involved. Join the crew of the USS Enterprising Individuals. Just head to patreon.com/EISTpod. Anyone can join our crew. Whether or not you're a coffee drinker, all are welcome at patreon.com/EISTpod. And as always, the best way to support the show is to tell a friend. Anything you contribute to the show will be appreciated and will help keep us flying. Thanks. Our top comment on social media this week comes from Twitter user Anita Bischoff at @Gemini_53. Anita tweeted in response to last week's episode, quote, "Just wanted to say how much I love the conversation you had with Lee Sargent on the Devil in the Dark show," end quote. Thanks, Anita. I'm so glad that I finally connected with Lee. It only took me experiencing practically how the International Dateline works, but we figured it all out. Spoiler alert, they're a day ahead of us, basically. But when he picked The Devil in the Dark to talk about, I thought, okay, sure, classic ep, the Horta, got it. But he really made a believer out of me with the idea that that episode is just pure, unadulterated Trek, like right from the source. It really is a fun episode. And it was a fun talk with him, and I definitely need to get him back on the program soon. Us Farscape fans have to stick together. But listeners, please check out his ongoing Star Trek art project, Star Trek 365, featuring fan-created Trek art. It's at StarTrek365.com. One program he will not be on, because of the aforementioned international dateline, is Discoverage, our live Star Trek Discovery recap show. Every Thursday night, live at 9 p.m. Central, I and my co-host Ella Pearson are joined by a special guest to discuss the latest episode of Star Trek Discovery. These live shows have been so much fun to do, and we hope that you'll join us on Thursday nights if you can. Watch the episode on CBS All Access. They usually drop at 7:30 p.m. Central, maybe a little before. Then chill for a little bit, get a beverage, come back, join us on Discoverage to hear our thoughts and analysis of that night's episode. You can follow us on Twitter to get a notification of when we're live, or you can listen to the show directly from our Spreaker page. If you can't join us live, no worries. All Discoverage shows are still available the day after in our show feed. But if you do listen live, tweet to us at EISTPod with the hashtag Discoverage and get your comments read on the air. Make your voice heard. Make it heard by following us at EISTPod on Facebook and Twitter, and join our Facebook group, Enterprising Interlocutions, where we have deeper discussions about the kind of topics that we explore on the show. Back to Anita. Thank you for your comment. For top comment this week, you win an unlimited supply of dead octopuses. And hopefully you'll get to use them soon. If not this April, maybe next year. Don't stop believing. And that's it for this supplemental episode of Enterprising Individuals. If you're an Apple Podcast listener and you haven't yet, why not look us up on Apple Podcasts and make sure that you're subscribed to the show. Also, write us a little review if the spirit moves you, and give us a rating at the very least. We'd appreciate it. If you're not an Apple Podcasts user, you can still subscribe to the show on Google Play or Stitcher or wherever you get our show from. And if you leave positive comments and ratings and reviews on those platforms as well, we would be eternally grateful. Next week on Enterprising Individuals, exploring space is dangerous. You could get sucked into a black hole, get blown up by a supernova, or you could trip into a flower bed and be summarily executed by a bunch of Coppertone models. Hold on to your hats, because Stuart Hollis and Thad Haight of the Delta Flyer podcast join the show next week to talk about an early episode of Star Trek The Next Generation that promises consequence-free play, but delivers summary judgment at the end of a needle. It's Justice, next time on Enterprising Individuals. And until then, I'm your Captain Caliban, signing off and saying live long and prosper.